Thank you for watching Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Budnam. I am thankful to all news resources which include American, British, European, African, Asian channels and all news agencies. Now the headlines. Russian presidential elections started, whereas Ukraine is attacking Russian territory. Differences in Israeli leadership regarding Gaza. Trump case in Florida. Vice President Harris in abortion clinic. Japan refuses gay rights. SpaceX rocket launch. President Biden is worried about Ukraine and Gaza situation. French President Macron talks. Black women in higher education. TikTok is hot topic in Canada. Contractor and mass killer in court. Judge under trial. Prince Harry landslide in California. Now the news in detail.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Gaza, at least 5 people were killed Wednesday when Israel bombed an UNRWA aid distribution center in Rafah, one of the UN agency's last remaining aid sites in Gaza. At least 1 UN worker was among the dead. UNRWA workers decried the attack.
This is forbidden. We are an international institution. All of this is for people. We stopped returning to our homes. We work day and night to serve refugees. It is forbidden. Look, what is this? We take all of this to the elderly and children. What is this?
The head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, said the attack was a, quote, blatant disregard to international humanitarian law, unquote. The attack comes as much of Gaza is on the brink of famine as Israel continues to limit the amount of aid allowed into the besieged territory. At least 27 Palestinians have died of starvation, including 23 children. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera is reporting 6 Palestinians were killed in Gaza City when Israeli forces opened fire again on crowds waiting for food aid. Over 80 people were injured. In other news from Gaza, Politico is reporting the Biden administration privately told Israel the U.S. would support Israel attacking Rafah as long as it doesn't carry out a large-scale invasion. Israel's announced it wants to transfer most of the over 1.4 million people seeking refuge in Rafah to what it called humanitarian islands in other parts of Gaza. On Wednesday, one family in Rafah broke their Ramadan fast in the rubble of their destroyed home.
Last Ramadan was great, but this year it's not. A lot of things are not there anymore. My sisters, my family, our house got destroyed. There's still people under the rubble, and they're still not pulled out. This house was a children's dream. Their toys and everything is lost.
A new UN investigation has accused Israel of breaking international law over the killing of Reuters video journalist Issam Abdallah in Lebanon. On October 13th, an Israeli tank opened fire on Abdallah and a group of other journalists. The UN report stated, quote, the firing at civilians, in this instance clearly identifiable journalists, constitutes a violation of international law, unquote. Back in the U.S., hundreds of activists partially shut down the international terminal of San Francisco International Airport Wednesday to demand a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and that the U.S. stop arming Israel. Protesters blocked outside traffic and security check-in, forcing SFO to close certain checkpoints and roadways. One traveler stopped to thank the protesters for the disruption.
I am slightly inconvenienced, so my trip doesn't go exactly as planned, but I still have a life. I can still live. I'm not dying. I'm not starving. These people are starving.
Here in New York, activists successfully canceled a planned real estate event in Brooklyn this week that sought to sell homes built on illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. This came just days after hundreds of activists in New Jersey marched through the streets of Teaneck Sunday to protest a similar real estate fair. It was taking place in a synagogue. Protests continue on Capitol Hill as well. On Tuesday, members of Jewish Voice for Peace occupied the office of Congressmember Hakeem Jeffries, calling on the Democratic leader to reject funding from AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Jeffries is one of AIPAC's largest recipients. The action came as over 20 groups launched the Reject AIPAC coalition, established to counter the powerful lobby group's influence in D.C., and calling on elected officials to reject endorsements and contributions from AIPAC. The House overwhelmingly voted Wednesday in favor of a bill that would force TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to either sell the social media app or face a ban in the U.S. Backers of the bill claim TikTok poses a national security threat. Rights groups like the ACLU say such a ban would violate the right to free speech. There are well over 150 million TikTok users in the U.S. alone. After voting, 2 of the lawmakers who voted against the measure, Democrats Ro Khanna and Pramila Jayapal, laid out some of the bill's issues.
It's an overly broad bill that I don't think will withstand First Amendment scrutiny. The other issue is that there are a lot of people who make their livelihoods on this.
There are timeline questions. 180 days to sell a company this size is very difficult. What happens to antitrust law? Does it still apply? Does it not apply? And I think the questions of if this is a de facto ban, I think that is a real problem. And so, but I also have problems, by the way, 4 countries are named, but if Saudi Arabia buys it, is that fine?
The measure will now be taken up by the Senate. Meanwhile, Palestinian rights activists say Israel's war on Gaza has galvanized anti-TikTok sentiment in conservative and centrist lawmakers. In a leaked post-October 7th audio recording, Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the Anti-Defamation League, can be heard saying, quote, we have a TikTok problem, unquote, referencing declining public support for Israel among younger people. The progressive group Roots Action also noted that AIPAC is the top donor to Congressmember Mike Gallagher, who authored the TikTok ban bill. This comes as Donald Trump flipped his position on the bill within the last week, now opposing the ban after recently meeting with Republican billionaire megadonor Jeff Yass. Yass's company holds a 15% stake in ByteDance. A plan to establish a new presidential council in Haiti appears to be crumbling after a number of prominent Haitian politicians and parties have refused to participate. Earlier this week, Caribbean leaders and the United States put forward a plan to establish a 7-person panel to rule Haiti and appoint a new prime minister to replace Ariel Henry, who agreed to resign after facing an armed uprising. In related news, the Biden administration is reportedly considering housing Haitian refugees at Guantanamo Bay if there's an influx of migrants. Meanwhile, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has deployed soldiers from the National Guard to block Haitians from reaching Florida. United Nations and aid groups are warning nearly 230,000 children and new mothers in Sudan could die from starvation in the coming months if their nutritional and health needs remain unmet. The humanitarian crisis in Sudan comes as rival military factions continue to fight despite calls for a Ramadan ceasefire. Earlier this week, the Sudanese military regained control of Sudan's national radio and television headquarters, which had been seized by the paramilitary rapid support forces. In Bolivia, non-stop rain in the capital La Paz prompted authorities to declare a state of emergency earlier this week as overflowing rivers destroyed homes and killed at least one person. Nearly 50 people have been killed due to flooding since the rainy season in Bolivia started in January. This is an official from La Paz.
In nearly 80 years, we haven't seen such an event with these characteristics, and in this period, we have had too close to each other. Another unusual event was 9 days of continuing rain. There wasn't any minute during these 9 days that the city wasn't raining.
In other climate news, the International Energy Agency warns methane emissions remain at highs. The agency said, quote, a 75% cut in methane emissions from fossil fuels by 2030 is imperative to stop the planet from warming to a dangerous level, unquote. The oil industry is the largest producer of methane, and the U.S. is the largest emitter of methane from oil and gas. Here in New York, activists with climate defiance confronted Chevron CEO Mike Wirth on Tuesday as he spoke at an event promoting, quote, the role of engaged men in gender inclusivity.
Is responsible for killing thousands of indigenous women and exposing thousands more to cancer and reproductive illness. You are not an ally of women. You are a murderer.
Chevron CEO Mike Wirth was forced to leave the event. Federal investigators looked into the Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 MAX door blowout, say their work is being hampered by Boeing's lack of cooperation and major issues with its record-keeping. The National Transportation Safety Board said Boeing was not able to provide the name of the employee who worked on the failed door plug and that Boeing overwrote surveillance footage of the plug's reinstallment. Meanwhile, the New York Times reports Boeing failed 33 out of 89 audits conducted by the Federal Aviation Administration on the 737 MAX. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld a Texas law that prevents young people from confidentially accessing birth control from clinics. The court ruled clinics can be required to notify and get consent from parents. Planned Parenthood criticized the ruling, saying it marks a, quote, significant and dangerous departure from decades of precedent that's allowed all young people to confidentially get basic health care like birth control through Title X, unquote. In other reproductive rights news, Vice President Kamala Harris is visiting an abortion clinic in Minnesota today in a show of support for abortion rights. It's the first such public appearance by any president or vice president in history. In Georgia, a judge tossed out 6 of the charges in the wide-ranging election subversion case against Donald Trump and some of his 18 co-defendants. Fulton County Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee said the charges, which relate to Trump pressuring officials into violating election laws, lack detail, but that prosecutors could seek a re-indictment on those counts. This comes as Judge McAfee is expected to announce his decision soon on whether to disqualify Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis from the case over an alleged improper relationship with a special prosecutor. In Oklahoma, a medical examiner ruled non-binary teen Nex Benedict died of suicide. 16-year-old Nex Benedict's death last month came one day after they were attacked in a girls' bathroom by fellow students at Owasso High School. Benedict's autopsy showed a lethal mix of antihistamines and antidepressants in their system. Nex Benedict identified within the two-spirit, transgender, and gender nonconforming umbrella. And longtime LGBTQ+ activist and political advisor David Mixner has died at 77. A friend said the cause of death was complications of long-term COVID. David Mixner was famously close friends with Bill Clinton, whose presidential campaign he worked on, but the relationship fractured after Clinton walked back his promise to end discrimination against LGBTQ people in the military, which Mixner harshly condemned. He was arrested in a 1993 protest against Clinton's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy outside the White House. This is David Mixner on Democracy Now! In 1996.
And we've got to get our act together. You know, the Christian Coalition's been organizing. They've been taking over school boards. They've been taking over water boards. They've been taking over taxation boards at the local level. And for years, I think on the progressive movement on the left, we have accepted the criteria that they're better than the other guy. And so we have always been put in that position of accepting someone just a little better than someone.
Bienvenue à tous. Welcome to the World Roundup here on France 24. I'm Mark Owen. These are the main world news headlines. Macron warns against imposing limits on support for Ukraine. Speaking on French national television, President Macron said, if Russia wins this war, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. Cargo is being loaded onto a second aid ship as the first closes in on the coast of Gaza. Meanwhile, the most prominent Jewish politician in the US is calling on Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu to stand down. Elon Musk's Starship rocket soared into space, leaving the world behind as it reached speeds of 26,000 kilometers per hour, but it came back down to Earth with a bump. The rocket was lost on re-entry over the Indian Ocean. This is World Roundup. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. The French President Emmanuel Macron is warning that limiting support for Ukraine in its war against Russia could lead to Kyiv's defeat and destroy Europe's credibility and security. Speaking on French network TV, President Macron said if Russia wins the war, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. Calling the conflict in Ukraine existential for our Europe and for France, Macron said anybody advocating limits on aid to Ukraine chooses defeat. He said there have been too many limits in our vocabulary since the Russian invasion of February 2022.
Bonsoir, Monsieur le Président.
Bonsoir.
On Thursday at the Élysée Palace, President Macron not only refused to rule out the idea of French boots on the Ukrainian ground, but doubled down, saying that fixing a limit on what France would do to stop Russia would be a sign of weakness.
Je pourrais vous dire ce soir.
I could say to you tonight, it's far away, we are for peace. But those who say that, the same people who don't want to support Ukraine, they are not choosing peace, they are choosing defeat, giving up on sovereignty. Because they're making the choice of saying, we have lines we won't cross.
He would not be drawn, though, on what it would take for France to send in troops, adding that it was not his wish, and that he was not seeking escalation.
We have limited our vocabulary too much. We are not escalating things, we are not at war with Russia, but we must not let Russia win either.
Adding that all options were on the table to assist Ukraine. The sit-down interview came after a shift in the French position earlier this year. Emmanuel Macron, having, by his own admission, been the Western leader who had spoken the most with President Putin over the years, and having said in the early months of the Russian invasion that the war must not end in a humiliation for Russia. But in February, the president signed a €3 billion bilateral security agreement with President Zelensky, soon after launching the French-led artillery coalition to help meet the needs of the struggling Ukrainian counter-offensive.
Antonia Kerrigan with that report. There have been a series of attacks on Belgorod, on the Russian side of the border with Ukraine. The governor of Russia's Belgorod region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, says that at least 3 separate waves of aerial attacks killed 2 people, wounding several others. Now, this came as voting starts in Russia's election. The polling booths will be open for over 3 days. Vladimir Putin is going to win, and so extend his rule by another 6 years. There's no actual opposition running against Putin in an election regarded as a sham. The World Roundup can unite with this.
In the Russian-annexed city of Mariupol, voting has started early, under strict surveillance. In an election that will bear no surprises, President Vladimir Putin is urging Russians to head to the polls.
I know that you understand what a difficult period our country is going through right now, what complicated challenges we face in almost all areas. Each of your votes is valuable and significant.
His opponents have all been carefully curated by the Kremlin, meaning a win for Putin is close to guaranteed. So the challenge for the president isn't to be re-elected, it's to ensure the highest possible turnout to avoid any questioning of his legitimacy. With that in mind, the Russian propaganda machine is in full swing. One strategy is telling Russians that the act of voting is an act of resistance to the enemy.
Foreign agents are joining forces with the Ukrainian Nazis.
Yes, traitors, foreign agents, all these demons are at work. They won't manage to achieve anything, of course.
This is the kind of discourse circulating on Russian television. It's a rhetoric fit for war, as the Russian military fights off an armed offensive in the regions of Kursk and Belgorod. The attacks have been claimed by Russian paramilitary battalions, fighting alongside Ukrainian forces.
Dear compatriots, we aren't coming to massacre, destroy, or punish you. We're coming to free you from misery, from poverty, and from fear. To free you from the terrorist organization's dictatorship that has seized power.
Though unlikely to change any outcome in the election, it's a dent in the united front presented by Putin. His re-election would extend his rule until at least 2030. After that, a change he made to the constitution in 2020 would allow him to run yet again.
As the first aid ship bound for Gaza is closing in on its destination, a second ship is being loaded up in Cyprus. While this aid will be welcomed by Palestinians on the brink of famine, the UN says they must be allowed to get more food and supplies into Gaza immediately, and Egypt has added its voice to call for access for aid and aid workers. This week, a UN food warehouse in Rafah was struck by an Israeli hit, killing a UN staff member and injuring over 20 others. Pressure is growing on Benjamin Netanyahu from Washington. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is calling on Israel's long-serving Prime Minister to stand down. Schumer is the highest-ranking Jewish politician in the United States. The US remains Israel's most important ally. Schumer says Netanyahu has lost his way. Fraser Jackson has more. He's in Washington.
The United States Senate top Democrat had a stunning rebuke of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Thursday, calling him, quote, an obstacle to peace. Chuck Schumer, himself a Jewish person and the highest-ranking Jewish person in the US government, said that Benjamin Netanyahu was putting his political survival ahead of Israel's security needs, saying, quote, at this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel. Well, the backlash was swift from the Republicans. The top Republican in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, saying that it was grotesque and hypocritical for Americans to hyperventilate about foreign interference in our own democracy to call for the removal of a democratically elected leader of Israel, saying it was, quote, unprecedented. Also, pushback coming from Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, saying that Israel was not a banana republic and that Netanyahu leads a policy that has widespread public support. The White House is finding itself increasingly between a rock and a hard place. There are growing frustrations between Joe Biden and Netanyahu, mainly over Israel's failure to protect Palestinian civilians and also the obstruction of aid into Gaza. The National Security Council spokesperson, John Kirby, saying that we're seeing not as much effort being applied by the Israeli side to increase that flow. There have been growing calls for aid to Israel, military aid given by the United States, to be conditioned. That is something that senators such as Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders have been saying for weeks, and we are hearing that Joe Biden's administration is starting to mull that over, especially in the face of a planned offensive into Rafah in the south of Gaza, where over 1 million Gazans have been forced to flee. Joe Biden's administration apparently mulling over whether to condition Israeli aid should no plan be given to protect civilian lives in the face of that offensive.
The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has appointed his longtime economic advisor to be the next Prime Minister in the face of US pressure to reform the Palestinian Authority as part of Washington's post-war vision for the Gaza Strip. Mohammed Mustafa, a US-educated economist and political independent, will head a technocratic government in the Israeli-occupied West Bank that could potentially administer Gaza ahead of eventual statehood. Those plans face major obstacles, including strong opposition from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel's bombardment of Gaza that's still grinding on with no end in sight. Over 31,300 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th in that Israeli bombardment. There remain some 134 Israeli hostages still held in Gaza. Their fate is headline news. Their families are piling pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to bring them home alive. A group of Israeli women, including relatives of the hostages held in Gaza, blocked the main Ayalon Road in Tel Aviv this Thursday to demand a deal to release them. There have been ongoing protests and rallies to keep the hostages in the view since they were kidnapped by Hamas government on October the 7th. Eliza Herbert has this.
Sharon and her husband Nissan are at a loss. They say their energy is low and their mental health is deteriorating each day that they hear no news of Nissan's brother, Ofer, who was taken hostage by Hamas on October 7. The situation was made worse when Ramadan came and still no truce was in sight.
When Mondays passed and nothing happened, we broke. It was very hard because we really believe that this is the day that something will happen.
In the week leading up to Ramadan, mediators appeared optimistic that they could broker a deal that would see a 6-week ceasefire in exchange for the release of some of the hostages, among other terms. Israel wanted a list of the names of all living hostages. Hamas wanted to ensure a total ceasefire and full withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. Ultimately, Netanyahu's regime pushed on with his pledge to achieve total victory over Hamas.
The government, they don't know anything about Ofer and where is he and what's going on. They're guessing that he is alive because they didn't get any. It's like, no news, good news.
Support workers say that many families of hostages are in need of psychological care, but that they don't have time to seek treatment.
This is a situation called ambiguous loss, and it's now for over 5 months. So we know from our survey that the physical condition and mental condition of the families deteriorate with time.
Many are turning their anguish into activism and marching in the streets of Tel Aviv, calling on the Israeli government to do more to return their kin.
And we're watching, of course, for all developments on that situation. Next, amnesty granted to the Catalonia separatists in a bill signed into law by Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. Sanchez has kept his side of a deal struck last year to keep him in power with their support. It followed the election in July with no clear winner. The amnesty could mean the return home of the former Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont, who fled the country wanted for treason in the wake of an ill-fated declaration of independence for Catalonia some 6 years ago.
It's quite reasonable to think that I will be able to be present at the next debate of the president in Catalonia.
Today, the most important thing is to send a message of hope to everyone who was unfairly the subject of retaliation and their families, who are in the center of Junt's political negotiations. This amnesty law now is for all of them.
Space exploration next, the ups and downs. The billionaire Elon Musk, his Starship rocket soared high into space in its third test launch from base camp in Boca Chica, Texas. Top speed of more than 26,000 kilometers per hour, altitude of more than 200 kilometers above sea level. That was the up. The down. Starship was lost as it re-entered the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean.
Third time unlucky for Starship, the most powerful rocket in the solar system. After flying further and faster than ever before, instead of splash landing in the Indian Ocean, SpaceX technical teams lost contact with the vessel as it re-entered the atmosphere.
We lost the data a couple of minutes ago. We haven't heard from the ship up until this point, and so the team has made the call that ship has been lost.
Neither the technical teams nor the company's eccentric billionaire founder were demoralized, though. Dan Puo hailing the incredible progress made, and Elon Musk tweeting that Starship would make life multiplanetary and would take humanity to Mars. After the 121-meter rocket lifted off from Boca Chica, Texas, and flew halfway around the world, reaching a top speed of 16,000 kilometers per hour and a peak altitude over 200 kilometers above sea level. NASA, too, hailed it as a successful test flight, of strategic interest to the Americans as they prepare to send crews back to the moon in 2026, and have partnered with SpaceX to use a variant of the $90 million Starship for the lunar landing phase. Elon Musk's ambitions go further, planning to send people and cargo to the moon later this decade, and, down the line, establish a civilization of 1 million people on Mars.
With my feet here on the ground in Paris, I can say that's it for me and the team. But stay with us for more news and analysis. You're watching Fast 24.
And welcome to Talking Europe here in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. This week, this is the third episode in our ongoing series, debate series.
On this Thursday night, the second man behind the ArriveCan app on the hot seat. His pleas of ignorance and the disbelief of MPs.
Come on, Mr. Anthony. Were you living under a rock for the last 3 years?
Complex case, how a 15-year legal battle finally ended for Canada's first judge to stand trial for murder. Profits running dry.
We've got an issue right now with 3 years of no income.
Will BC's multi-million-dollar aid package be enough to save its wineries? And third time, not completely lucky for the world's most powerful rocket.
It is rocket science after all.
How it made a giant leap before it was lost.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The ArriveCan app, which cost Canadians close to $60 million to create, was under scrutiny again today in Ottawa. One of the co-owners of the private company given a lucrative contract to create the app said he had little to do with it, even though he's vice president and the chief security officer. Darren Anthony faced tough questions from MPs, including whether he ever read the damning Auditor General's report that said poor record keeping made it impossible to determine the total cost to taxpayers.
And they've raised major red flags about your corporate practices of a company that you're one of the two principals, and you haven't even read the reports. That's correct. How can you dispute the findings of the reports if you haven't read them? Do you intend to read the Auditor General's report after this meeting's over? No.
Anthony often pleaded ignorance, saying he didn't have answers to MPs' questions. Abigail Beeman has our top story tonight.
Call this meeting to order.
MPs of all stripes had trouble believing testimony from the other half of GC Strategies, Darren Anthony.
I have no knowledge of that.
Come on, Mr. Anthony. You read papers, you watch the news. Were you living under a rock for the last 3 years? Did you not experience the frustrations that millions of Canadians had at airports, border crossings? Come on. No one believes you. I certainly don't believe you.
Consulting the same lawyer as partner Christian Firth off camera, Anthony's strategy was to keep as much space as possible between him and the ArriveCan app, even though he's one half of a two-man operation.
Literally everything to do with the ArriveCan scam was flowed directly through Christian Firth. It had no DNA of you on it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I was not involved.
But Anthony didn't dispute that he took home more than $1 million in taxpayer money for it.
Can you explain to me how you're comfortable taking $1.25 million, but you're also very comfortable washing your hands off from anything that has to do with the ArriveCan? I can only speak about my contracts.
In fact, he gave the impression he didn't know much about a lot of company operations.
Are the endorsements on your website fake, like the resumes that were provided in order to win government contracts?
I have no idea.
Most jaw-dropping, while he said the Auditor General's report on the costs of ArriveCan was wrong.
Have you read the Auditor General's report? I have not read it, no.
He has no plans to read it either. And if you need more evidence of why Anthony seemed unreliable, listen to how he described his business partner.
He's honest, trustworthy, hardworking man and apparent. I have no doubt that he's done nothing wrong, and I'm confident all independent investigation will establish that. Were you reading what you just said, sir, or were you speaking from the heart? speaking from the heart. I don't even know what to say. This is so ridiculous.
Anthony couldn't tell the committee how many taxpayer dollars he's taken home since 2015, and while his partner promised to hand over documents and answers he didn't have Wednesday by 9 a.m. Thursday morning, when this meeting started, MPs learned he'd only turned over about 25%. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
A day after the U.S. voted to ban TikTok, Canada's industry minister has revealed a national security review of the popular video sharing app is already underway here. A review of TikTok's proposal to expand its business in Canada was ordered back in September. The industry minister says the law prevents the government from revealing details. On Wednesday, American lawmakers passed a law to ban TikTok in the U.S. if its Chinese parent company doesn't divest its U.S. assets within 6 months. A man charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder after a mass killing in an Ottawa suburb last week appeared in court today. The 19-year-old is accused of killing a mother, her 4 young children, along with a family friend, plus attempting to kill the children's father. Mackenzie Gray is outside the courthouse in Ottawa. Mackenzie.
Dawn, it was a quick phone appearance here at the Ottawa courthouse for the alleged mass murderer. Fabio de Souza has been in custody since his arrest on March 6th and will stay there until at least the 28th, with both the Crown and his lawyers agreeing to adjourn his case without entering a plea or having a bail hearing.
I've met him over video and in person.
Can you have from that meeting any sense of what may happen?
I can't comment on that, I'm so sorry.
That's the accused's lawyer, who said de Souza is in protective custody, but shared little other information with reporters, including if he plans to ask for a mental health assessment of his client.
By the nature of the case, it seems to me that we're going to be looking at some pretty significant psychiatric evaluations, and that's where the complexity is going to lie. It's going to take months and months before we even get to the point where we're moving into a trial situation.
De Souza allegedly killed 6 people he lived with. A funeral for the victims now scheduled for Sunday in Ottawa, including 4 kids, the youngest 2 months old, along with their mother. The husband and father, Danushka Vikramasinghe, survived an alleged attack from de Souza, who he met while studying at Algonquin College in Ottawa. A source close to Vikramasinghe says he was released from hospital today, still recovering from serious injuries to his face and hands from what police describe as a knife-like attack. The motive for de Souza's alleged crimes still unknown.
They will interview the father, they will interview the suspect, they will interview neighbors, and they will also interview anybody else who may have information that will contribute to understanding the motive.
The Crown had to resubmit the charges today after making multiple spelling errors on the victims' names, the second major mistake authorities have made on the case, Donna, after the police chief originally said the murders were a mass shooting.
Okay, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa, thank you. Some Canadian diplomatic staff in Haiti have been airlifted out of the country to reduce Canada's footprint in the volatile country. Government officials say a number of embassy workers were taken by helicopter to neighboring Dominican Republic today. Other countries, such as the U.S., have already done so. Essential employees remain, including Canada's ambassador, and the embassy is still closed to the public. About 3,000 Canadians are still believed to be in Haiti. Global Affairs says there is no immediate plan to evacuate them. Israel's prime minister is vowing to forge ahead with his plan for a military invasion of Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip, and Israel claims it will move Palestinians towards what it calls humanitarian islands. There's no evidence any place like that actually exists in Gaza. About 1.5 million people are believed to be taking shelter in Rafah, and for them, finding food, shelter, and medicine is becoming next to impossible. Crystal Gamancing now on the efforts to get more aid in, and the story of one Canadian who managed to deliver some by hand.
Young and old, all clamoring for something to eat. The UN now says 1/4 of Gaza's population is a step away from famine.
The people in Gaza need a break. They need aid. They need humanitarian and medical.
Riyam Al-Safadi is a Syrian Canadian who just a few days ago made a nearly impossible trip into Gaza as a part of a convoy with the WHO and other organizations delivering suitcases of medical aid to hospitals and clinics in the south.
The demand inside is huge. I have been to a couple of hospitals and they are in dire need. Even the medical staff are malnourished.
Al-Safadi helped deliver the basics donated from Canada and Egypt, including gauze, bandages, painkillers, and antibiotics. But he says it wasn't nearly enough.
Let it be clear, it's a drop in the bucket.
The situation is so dire, attempts are underway to bring in aid from the sea, with 200 tons of food approaching Gaza over the Mediterranean.
I'm very hopeful that we can be bringing millions and millions of meals daily. We may fail. Many things still may not allow us to be successful on this mission.
Jose Andres says the biggest failure would not be trying. While some aid is trucked in or dropped by planes, a second barge was loaded in Cyprus. Several American Army military vessels are also en route to Gaza with supplies and engineers. They're tasked to build a temporary roll-on, roll-off pier, which could end up looking something like this, an artificial floating harbor similar to those built in Normandy by Allied forces during the Second World War. But in this conflict, Chuck Schumer called the Israeli prime minister one of the major obstacles to peace.
Who has all too frequently bowed to the demands of extremists, like Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and the settlers in the West Bank.
We cannot just parachute medical aid or aid from the sky, at the same time continue on supplying weapons and arms and bombs that will kill civilians.
Ignoring outside pressure, Benjamin Netanyahu met with soldiers telling them they will keep going and enter Rafah, saying Hamas must be eliminated for Israel's security. Crystal Gamancing, Global News, London.
Russia says Ukraine has fired more missiles at its border regions on the eve of Russia's presidential election. Russian officials say Ukraine targeted the Kursk region and fired at least 8 missiles at the Belgorod border region, killing 2 people and wounding 12 others. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has killed or imprisoned his political opponents, will easily win a 5th term. His only opponents left are candidates carefully curated by the Kremlin, who pose no real threat to his re-election. A long legal battle finally ends in Quebec. Coming up, what will happen to a former judge accused of killing his wife? After 15 years of legal battles, a retired Quebec City judge pleaded guilty today to manslaughter in the death of his wife. Jacques Delisle was originally convicted of first-degree murder after his wife's death in 2009. He spent nearly a decade in prison, always insisting he was innocent. Mike Armstrong explains.
The prosecution of Jacques Delisle is now over, basically because neither side wants to keep fighting. The 88-year-old retired judge walked back into a Quebec City courtroom, admitting his role in the death of his wife.
What the accused said today before the court, that he minimally handled the gun, loaded the gun, and gave it to his spouse, that he knows she was about to kill herself.
Delisle's wife died in their Quebec City home in 2009. Marie-Nicole Rainville was partially paralyzed and depressed. Delisle went out for a walk and returned to find Rainville with his pistol on her lap, being shot in the head. In his trial for first-degree murder in 2012, DeLille never testified in his defense. The only time the jury heard his voice was this awkward 911 call.
Madame, je suis arrivé, madame, genre, ma conjointe est enlevée la vie. Qu'est-ce que je fais? Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? J'ai aucune idée, là. Elle peut... Mais qu'est-ce qu'elle fait présentement, là? Pardon? Vous êtes où, premièrement? Je suis chez moi.
Now, DeLille claimed his wife had gotten the weapon herself, but the jury had heard how sick Haneville had been, and even DeLille's own lawyer admits it was hard to believe.
He raised suspicions, I'm sure, with such a, what do you say in English, fucking bull story, something like that?
DeLille served 8 years and 310 days in prison. He was eventually released when the federal justice minister ruled that he believed mistakes had been made and ordered a new trial. Well, starting last December, the two sides went through mediation and agreed to a guilty plea of manslaughter.
This case, somewhere, sometime, has to come to an end.
Now, the plea doesn't mean the sides agree. Manslaughter was the middle ground, enough to get DeLille a one-day sentence as a formality and to end a decade and a half of legal wrangling. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
Industry in limbo ahead. Why BC wineries are worried about their future. In California, a landslide in Los Angeles early Wednesday destroyed one home and left two others perched precariously on a hillside. It happened in Sherman Oaks, about 20 kilometers from downtown LA. No injuries have been reported. Since January, the LA area has received more than 40 centimeters of rain, nearly twice what it normally gets by this time of year. British Columbia's wine industry is suffering the effects of climate change. Extreme weather in the last few years has hurt vineyards. It's a problem plaguing grape growers in other parts of Canada too. BC's government has launched a $70 million plan to help BC's winemakers, but some say the losses are so severe, the survival of the industry is at stake. Neetu Garcha explains.
And get some light in there.
Some BC interior wineries are expecting catastrophic losses for their latest vintages.
Total mortality in a lot of places.
Two severe winter cold snaps in consecutive years have devastated vineyards across the region, leaving winemakers uncertain about the future of their wines and even their livelihoods.
We have to pivot, so rethinking our structure of how we're actually growing the vine, maybe.
Winery owner Suki Sikon says the situation is dire.
We're going to have to replant our whole vineyard, 100 acres over the next 2 years. So impact-wise, it's going to be very significant because in 2 years' time we won't have any wine to sell.
The full extent of the damage from the cold snap won't be confirmed until the spring, but like several winery owners in this region, Sikon predicts a more than 90% crop loss here at his vineyard in Coston, BC.
I think a lot of the smaller farmers and medium-sized farmers will not make it.
The BC government has responded to calls for help by announcing a new task force and replant program to support farmers affected by climate change.
The $70 million replanting program should hopefully go a long way to getting growers of fruits in our province back on their feet.
The news was welcomed by some at a gathering in Penticton, BC for wine industry leaders from across Canada. The president of a major Ontario-based business says it'll require rethinking, but the industry will survive.
If we lose 95% of a crop, we're going to have to replace that vintage with wine from another region. We'll need to make sure we label honestly and be totally transparent about what we're doing.
It's a $3.7 billion economic impact on the province, our industry. So it's not really just about the farmers and the winemakers. It's about the wine tourism and all that that brings.
The BC government also announced plans to work with manufacturers to enhance visitor experiences at wineries and promote tourism. But Sikon says the commitments don't go far enough for businesses like his.
We've got an issue right now with 3 years of no income. That's $1.5 million that we have to put into the system in order to operate. We don't know what's going to happen with staffing, and location will even survive.
As wine producers in Canada's biggest markets grow increasingly concerned about climate change, many will be watching how the region known as BC's wine country will weather this storm. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Coston, BC.
A hiker in Wales came across this, a steel monolith about 10 feet tall stuck in the ground on Hay Bluff, a hilltop on the border of Wales and England. The hiker says it looks like it was dropped there from space. He said there were no visible tracks around it. Similar structures have appeared before in England, the Netherlands, and Utah, and then disappeared just as mysteriously. Astronomical milestone next. SpaceX reaches new heights and then loses another rocket.
She told me that everyone has the potential to give something back. That everyone in need deserves a supporting hand in life.
Prince William spoke about his mother tonight at the 25th anniversary of the Diana Legacy Awards in London. The charity honors the memory of his mother, the late Princess Diana. 20 social activists were recognized for changing the world for the better. Diana advocated for many charities during her lifetime, including supporting the end of the use of landmines and eliminating the stigma of HIV and AIDS. William attended the event on his own. Prince Harry was expected to appear separately by video link from California. SpaceX launched the third test flight of its Starship rocket today, and it went farther and faster than the others. That part was perfect, but the rocket failed to land. The plan is for these rockets to be reusable, which means they have to land safely, not just take off. Elon Musk, who founded SpaceX 22 years ago today, has always done things differently, including exploring space. And as Mike Drolet reports, SpaceX still calls today's launch a phenomenal day.
SpaceX wasn't worried about the launch. They expected the most powerful rocket ever built to reach orbit. But after the first two test flights last year ended in massive explosions, the relief at SpaceX was palpable.
Making it this far is farther than we've gone on flight 2.
Onboard cameras offered stunning views of the red-hot plasma field as the craft re-entered Earth's atmosphere before it was lost. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration called it a mishap. SpaceX and NASA, which never expected the Starship to survive, deemed it a success.
It is rocket science after all. It's hard to achieve. Even if we've done it in different variations and different ways multiple times, every time is a new challenge.
A lot is riding on SpaceX getting this right to achieve the goal set out by CEO Elon Musk. In the short term, he needs the Starship to deliver large satellites into orbit. But more importantly, he's partnered with NASA on the Artemis 3 mission, which will send astronauts to the moon as early as 2026. Former astronaut Mike Massimino says without private industry, space exploration is just too expensive.
I think one of the reasons we haven't been back to the moon in 50 years is because up till recently NASA has been, and Canadian Space Agency, and other government agencies, space agencies have been dependent on the taxpayers' dollars. There's only so much you can do with that.
I need a moment to pick my jaw up from the floor because these views are just stunning.
Musk has said he wants to see hundreds of uncrewed flights before astronauts set foot inside the Starship. After that, the moon, which for Musk is merely a stepping stone to Mars. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
That is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Here Canada is Lake Louise in Banff National Park. Thanks for watching. Jeff Semple will be at the anchor desk tomorrow, and I will see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Good evening, I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the NewsHour tonight, the European Union's top diplomat on global efforts to get more aid into Gaza and to support Ukraine.
A legal settlement allows Florida teachers and students to talk about LGBTQ+ issues, but some restrictions remain.
And the pregnancy struggles of both Israeli survivors of October 7th and Gazans under siege.
I'm so exhausted. I can't even get up to play a mother's role in my baby's life. I can't walk or get up to feed him or hold him.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
the Candida Fund, committed to advancing restorative justice and meaningful work through investments in transformative leaders and ideas. More at candidafund.org. Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is taking on Israel's far-right government over the war in Gaza.
The highest-ranking Jewish elected official in the United States delivered a scathing 40-minute speech today. He charged that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has lost his way in the military drive to crush Hamas. Schumer said that Netanyahu and his government are an obstacle to peace and that Israel needs new elections.
The Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past.
Netanyahu's political party shot back that Israel is, quote, not a banana republic, and that its war policy has wide public support. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Palestinian officials said an aid warehouse was hit by an Israeli airstrike that killed 8 people. The Israelis said one was a Hamas commander. Palestinian Authority is getting a new prime minister, but the choice may not satisfy U.S. calls for reforms leading to a Palestinian state. President Mahmoud Abbas today named economist Mohammed Mustafa to the post. He's a longtime ally to Abbas, and whether he'll undertake real change is unclear. A federal judge in Florida has rejected former President Trump's motion to dismiss the classified documents case against him. Mr. Trump is accused of illegally storing sensitive records at his Mar-a-Lago estate after leaving office. Today's ruling came after Trump lawyers argued the law is vaguely worded and that he was allowed to keep anything he designated as personal. Prosecutors disputed those claims and said Mr. Trump urged others to lie and cover up. President Biden came out today against the planned sale of U.S. steel to a Japanese firm, saying it would harm American workers. That came as he made a campaign visit to Saginaw, Michigan. It was aimed at building support from black and union voters. And in Minnesota, Vice President Harris stopped at a Planned Parenthood facility that offers abortion services. It was said to be the first time that a sitting president or vice president has toured that kind of clinic. Former Trump Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has announced he's organizing a group of investors to buy TikTok. That comes after the House voted to ban the video sharing app in the U.S. unless it cuts ties with a Chinese-owned parent company. Mnuchin did not say who might be in that investor group. In Japan, a high court ruled that denying same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. The court has no power to overturn existing laws that restrict marriage. Instead, it urged the government to do so. Crowds in Tokyo cheered and hailed the decision as a step toward equality. But plaintiffs in the court case called the ruling only a partial victory.
I still think that we're so far behind other countries, we can't really be compared to them. It feels like Japan is the only country that's not changing. Even though our society is really changing, Japan alone has not changed at all. I'm boiling with anger.
Japan is the only member of the G7 industrial democracies that does not have legal protections for same-sex unions. The Elon Musk company SpaceX reached a kind of milestone today with the third test of its giant Starship rocket, but its luck didn't last. The unmanned spacecraft blasted off from South Texas and had a flawless flight for about an hour, but the rocket was apparently destroyed as it headed for a splashdown in the Indian Ocean. 2 previous test flights ended in explosions just after liftoff. On Wall Street, mixed economic data led stocks lower. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 137 points to close at 38,905. The Nasdaq fell 49 points. The S&P 500 slipped 14. And a passing of note: a leading civil rights activist of the 1960s, Dori Ann Ladner, died Monday in Washington. She began fighting for justice and equality as a teenager in her home state of Mississippi, and she was involved in every major civil rights protest of the 60s. Dori Ann Ladner was 81 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour: outrage and concern over the treatment of black women in higher education, how quantum computing could help us understand more about the universe and beyond. The mother of slain journalist James Foley discusses her new book about her son, plus much more.
This is the PDF NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
And we're by Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of European Union, Mr. These are research Israel and Gaza today. We saw the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer give a speech at Congress. He said Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been too willing to tolerate civilian toll in Gaza, which pushes support for Israel worldwide to historic lows.
Well, I perceive a change on the mood of the public opinion in the US with respect to what's happening in Gaza. More and more people are feeling concerned with what I certainly can call a massacre. Thousands of civilians killed. A lot of people has been saying that certainly. And not just in the US, it's the whole world what's happening now.
I think the majority leader's criticism was personal to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you agree with his criticism of Netanyahu's decision?
We in the European Union have priorities. One of the priorities would be to look for the state and to be in the right position government. And certainly we would have a leader who could be compatible with this approach.
It sounds like you don't think Netanyahu's compatible with that approach?
Well, Netanyahu has been saying that he's to demonstrate firm opposing to this.
This week he told the Security Council that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. How's that?
Using starvation in Gaza? Yes, using starvation in Gaza. And the thousands of people are starving literally. And they mentioned 9 starvation. If starvation, why is starvation? Because it's not maintaining support campaign to those people. And why is it? Because Israel is supporting the war and not maintaining support to army. So there's a lot of consequences. Even maintaining support to people are starving. He's still cause and effect.
The reason I'm using it as a weapon of war is suggesting that Israel specifically says that there's no restriction on the rate of trucks in and out, and they blame United Nations for capacity for that.
I don't think so.
Well, what's your evidence that
Israel that they control the border and support to army. I don't think that the US is doing anything in order to support coming in Gaza.
In the same speech where you accused Israel of using food as a weapon of war, you did not call on Hamas to release hostages or leave them
I'm not saying that every time. I take the full. I start saying that if anyone hostages is a must, and Hamas will release it. They have been saying and saying and I don't care to say it again. That Hamas is considered a organization that they want to attack, that it's completely unacceptable and the hostages have to be freed.
What's what Ukraine? Have you been able to speak to Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, to urge him to allow for a vote for $60 billion military and economic aid support back to Ukraine that's installed now?
No, not the Speaker of the House. They have the opportunity to with members of the House on the Republican side. And I'm trying to explain him and asking to explain to the police. Just imagine what could be the consequences of blockage of American support to Ukraine. Just imagine the Russian tanks breaking into the headline Ukraine, and putting up putting people on the imaging, and all the imaging works, putting people on the politics, being a security threat, the security cost for us civilians and for you, US people, all that pressure in Ukraine is so great, unreal. And I urge and everybody to understand that the support Ukraine has to be in the whole generosity of the people who are defending themselves from invasion, but also in their own weakness.
And the European Union provide military aid to Ukraine that is in enough quantity to replace American militaries.
But we know Ukraine has strong support because we have military capacity, but we can't compete with the US, maybe the US, certainly, if you could stop doing that, no one else, I think that.
There are questions in there, US liability. I think there's military planning for Germany, the US, with also NATO. There are considering their United Kingdom and France offer nuclear security guarantee. Do you support some of the countries?
That is not alternative for NATO to ensure Europe becomes a territorial affair of Russia and Ukraine. But at the same time, there's a growing feeling among Europeans that we have to develop more of our own capacities, just in case. Just in case, in the future, we should take more responsibility from our side. This is not bad news. On the contrary, they think that this war has represented a wake-up for European strategic thinking. There's a general feeling among Europeans that we can challenge the war. We need peace on the peace on the war, and we have to be ready for the challenge.
And it's not only about war, it's also about the economy of the President of the United States. Donald Trump called European Union economic foe. And the question whether the United States, if he were to be elected, would defend NATO allies in our life.
Well, it's probably exactly what we think about Trump, but I'm being real about it.
Thank you. Students and teachers in Florida now discuss sexual orientation and gender identity in a classroom setting, as long as it's not part of formal instruction. That's an important change. The Department of New Zealand reaching state and civil rights attorneys who challenge the law, like Brits, that don't say gay law. Here's Sunny Side.
Jackson Media State law, they have to on Florida, but students inspired by prohibitions. With the law in Florida, if teachers are free to use the word gay or transgender to students outside the classroom, or even celebrating identity or support the LGBTQ community, they no serious. We'll put this out, these are those concerns need to be put to rest. Those honors with Quality Florida and LGBTQ advocacy group will discuss.
There's no question that following this settlement, students, teachers, parents of LGBTQ students, and LGBTQ parents can say gay, can say trans, and be gay, can be trans in Florida's public schools and may not be afraid of the bullying and weaponization of this law to lead to censorship.
However, the law is not repealed and still prohibited explicit class rating on LGBTQ topics. And Florida government on Kansas, all the settlement, and major industry. For more on this, I'm Daniel Fire, education reporter with WNFE and NPR affiliate in Orlando. Danielle, thank you for joining the news hour. Help me understand what this settlement actually changed. I understand the text of the law was altered.
So actually clarifying the language of the law was like they, and moving forward as you're hearing your clip, parents and teachers and students will be able to speak freely and write freely after their identity and sexuality in classroom sessions, on essays, on projects, kids can be able to examine the characters, teachers can put safe stickers on also have gay straight alliances and other LGBTQ clubs at schools, so it really large parts of the law and clarify it.
But Danielle, the law does remain in effect. What restrictions are still in place?
Yeah, so the law still bans outrageous structure of identity and sexuality here in Florida, so that would include a class or a book looking at a section of a textbook that would instruct people in any way about their identity and sexuality. So the law is still in effect, as well as a lot of policies that might inspire by law, things like banning gay African American history because of queer it, or making it so that sociology no longer reporters or biographies that talk about human sexuality. So a lot of law and policies around the law still are very much in effect here in Florida.
It's interesting to see both sides of this, both LGBTQ advocates as well as Governor DeSantis seem to view this as a good thing. How do you view that?
Yeah, so basically the law is not return, it's not repealed, it's still very much in effect. So that's what the governor and his party is what it did ban for conservative gays in 2022 in the past, but it's also been for LGBTQ advocates, folks who have lived with this law for 2 years and were afraid to be out publicly in the school system hearing what I and one thing or as a teacher how to go in the classroom. So this is really a huge moment for the state of Florida.
You have been reporting on the impact now of this law. You have the talented and families who identify as LGBTQ. What has it been like for them since this law passed? How are you reacting to this settlement?
I spoke to so many people who, whether a teacher is gay or student is gay, felt like they really couldn't be gay, felt like they had to either stay in the closet or back in the closet, felt just very hurt and very sad by the fact that a big part of their identity was something that was somehow not appropriate enough to have before school. So this is such a win, such a 3 times celebration for them. I spoke to several plaintiffs who were on the lawsuit that resulted in this settlement, and they said that their 10-year-old son just said, wow, this isn't even fine to stay gay, mom, and look what we did. So this is a big moment, I think, for LGBTQ people around the state of Florida.
And yet other states use this Florida law as a template for their own prohibitions. When it comes to Florida, where does it go from here as far as legislation that would impact LGBTQ citizens?
Well, our legislative session last Wednesday on Friday, and most of our strongest anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans bills actually died in session. So there's kind of a trend that we're seeing that this kind of anti-LGBTQ push that was so strong before is being here in Florida. I know a lot of plaintiffs, a lot of people that were for the settlement, really felt people in our state paying close attention because they said, look what we did, look what we were able to accomplish. They were protests, and the white schools in this bill, you know, law, and obviously the lawsuit itself shows sometimes we see that for a long time, things can change. So they're hoping to inspire people in the states that still have strong anti-LGBTQ laws in place, and of course Florida itself still has a lot of laws in place, things like, ban gender here. So we'll have to see kind of the ripple effects of the settlement here in Florida and country.
Absolutely, Daniel Fire with WNFE and Orlando. Thanks so much for your reporting.
Thank you.
Of many forward, Palestinians and Israelis, this amount of attacks on war accused and those expected murders. The last settlement on the Middle Island and ensuring progress for pain, the pregnancies, for stars and their joys. Should be now. Each day in Gaza, mothers such as food for their children. One night, as the great airstrike counts to it, Israeli children will live to see the name. Expected to live their babies in the Middle East. An estimated 50,000 women Gaza are pregnant, with 180 babies being born each day. Medical staff report newborns being birthed from blood source and birth hospitals, overwhelmed hospitals. And cesarean sections carried out without transecting. 3 months ago, an emergency had an emergency C-section while she went into labor while being headed into Gaza. One hospital here, they want all the hospitals in the north of Israel and army staffing over her head. Both families now in infiltrated missions, but the wounds from cesarean have become badly infected. With medical staff almost wiped out, she's having doctors still having antibiotics to help her. I'm so exhausted. I can't even get up to take measures all my baby's life. I can't walk without the feet and hold him. Trapped by bombing for weeks, 3 months pregnant, and I'm finally made their check-up. The doctors had devastating news. There was no heartbeat. Well, still, they haven't been able to operate to remove these. Is there just too many critical patients? They have to treat first. The man told me one sepsis to kill her. I've known for a month now that baby is dead, and they still haven't removed the huge numbers of people here. I'm scared to have an operation by anesthesia. The doctor said I'm completely by the pregnancy. So we have nutrition, CS, and dilated nutrition, unusual massive wise, temperature and weight birth, miscarriages, and death, and mothers and newborns. Most of Gaza's hospitals have collapsed. Thanks to their bombardment and proceed. Cutting off baby's life and pregnancy. Rather than their hospital is still hanging on. Doctors and midwives say people they can cope. Doctors and midwives give pediatrician. There's a high percentage of pregnant cases. That high percentage of death. All of them are country. As a feet in the war. They have police cases. After the bomb release, they can have PSA, diabetes, and temperature. They have diarrhea, vomiting. Minister Tessie will report by the condition on mothers and babies with your split. It is unbelievable what's happening here at the Iran hospital. The situation is very desperate. Some mothers haven't made it through giving birth. We're going to immediately science. So the fight can stop. So the news and to bring them over their need.
As an national system across war in Israel, expected mothers live in the shadow of this war. In our collective midwives, self-hospital, one of the largest in Israel. For maternity care, have moved to a reinforced children after multiple hospitals.
Thursday morning, Thursday for families and for babies. Because they find the siren, we are not able to put it in to run, and we're going to work with it well. Maybe we'll hear the siren. So it's very emotional time. Very stressful time.
Most of she wants to survive to see her second child born, or he was saved her first. On October 7th, she and her husband and hid for a full day and night as a mass terrorist rampage. Their own house fires out on Gaza war, killing everyone in behind.
I find it extremely hard to talk about those hours. I sat there waiting for them to kill him. I barely looked at my son because I understood in my head that his life would end. Imagine thinking that for 25 hours.
In her second trimester, as now is hit by, she grew weaker. No one felt sure she would lose baby. Finally, they rescued by her soldiers the next morning. Hospital know, used to be middle of her core. She called the students to hang all night on both sides of the border. Now she doesn't know if she'll ever be safe again. Everything has changed. I don't care about anyone Gaza anymore. I won't forgive them. When something like that happens, something very, very deep breaks inside you. No, she'll never go back to Gaza. She now had a boy, Leah. Hotel funding what's left of their community. Back in Gaza, this takes multiple times from the day of bombardment. We mothers have nowhere safe to go, but then suction hospitals have no space to keep them. If they're lucky enough to survive a safe birth in these conditions, they go home to filthy, freezing cold shelters, living on a single meal a day. Baby will never go out to rescue. Mothers enjoy 16 bucks a day. Dozens are currently going to us.
It's full of positive release to the economy for children on streets. That always I have
the wife started birth an hour ago, but she hasn't been able to hold the baby and yet. He's in intensive care. They're both facing life-threatening issues because of the toxic smoke alive at the room in when people are so dangerous to keep warm.
This pregnancy is really hard on me. There's no food. I can't eat in a week.
The wife doesn't know how to feed baby Yanan. All the 12 other women kids in her extended family waiting back in the tent.
Our kids don't deserve anything. She's going to the streets without food, without shelter, eating without clothes. You're paying cold for us and not having to shelter. And now giving birth. God save us from what we're doing.
The UN has fought Gaza upwardly after children. Nearly 12,500 Gaza children have been killed since Israel began. That's more than the total number of children killed in all other global conflicts in previous war years combined. Mothers desperate to keep their children safe could be difficult to pray for an end to their nightmare. As this brutal war marches on, hopes of a peaceful future for Palestinian and Israeli children look starker than ever. With the FN now finally on hand on Israel border.
The death of the University of Missouri this year sparked outrage and broader concern about the treatment of black women in higher education and candidate by suicide in January. And scathing letters were shared by pattern employee and harassment at the hands of the university's president, John D. Mosley. He is now named administratively pending investigation that aims to weeks after Harvard's President, calling Dave resigned under pressure. All of it being without dialogue and acting the particular challenges and pressures that black women face. We spoke to a few women about this as part of ongoing coverage of voice maps. Here's part of the labels.
I'm Keisha Thomas. I'm at the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
My name is Dr. Candace Parrish, and I'm currently a visiting assistant professor at the University of North Carolina Wilmington.
My name is Shay Carter, and I am an assistant professor of political science and international relations at William and Mary University in Los Angeles.
I certainly have not been exposed to a case as tragic as Dr. Bailey's, although for those of us in higher ed, especially those of us who are in senior positions or leadership positions, it is often a conversation around chronic stress that we experience at burnout. That is experience, but also the isolation that has followed us for our entire careers.
I was very sad that it had gone so far and that she felt like she did not have the resources or what she needed to overcome this sort of situation. And it just got me thinking about how many more people like myself actually experience these sort of tragedies in academia.
I have absolutely experienced microaggressions with regard to the intersection of both my race and gender. In my entire time in my PhD program, there was never another black person above me or below me in their process, and so it was a very isolating experience.
I have had experiences, as have my colleagues, and it's not simply within our career, it starts in college and graduate school, and some of us even earlier. And so many of us, you see our education as an investment in our future and the futures of our families.
In my PhD program, it was a very, very tough experience in which there was no period where almost there was a lot of support, and there were people who were in charge of my academic PhD students who were manipulating things to against my favor.
Everything happening more right now, when there are coordinated efforts on the part of individuals and institutions to attack credibility of academic work, that's already something that bring anxiety. It can be particularly distressing.
Some of what we talked about today, I've heard similar complaints from colleagues in law and medicine, industries across the board. I think higher ed is different because oftentimes we are so severely underrepresented.
I actually stopped recommending academia as a job in community position to young people who are PhDs in teaching. I cannot vouch for their experiences, knowing the hard things that I have gone through and how much emotional trauma space it has taken.
Let's talk more about the particular stresses that black women in academia face. Dr. Reed Duke is a professor of sociology and co-director of the Light HD Health Research Lab at the University of Texas Dallas.
Thanks for having me.
Two consistent things we heard from the professors school of this: isolation and lack of support. How does that square with what you found in your research?
That is definitely miserable what we're finding in the work we're doing right now, collecting data on black women and faculty on the track. But they do experience forms of isolation, feeling like they're left out. Networks are not able to send their available to their colleagues. And the experiences of this lack of support they have is definitely something that they're seeing in what they're doing.
When we say that academia can be a high pressure, high stress, intense, some might say toxic environment, no matter one's background, what are some of the particular pressures that black women face in higher education?
This speaks to what women in the interview are saying, which is that we tend to be underrepresented. We make up 3.7% of overall tenure faculty in the United States. And so when we think about high pressure of positions of being faculty members, this means about top stress and demand of being researchers, successful teachers. We also are in a space where we may not even recognize that we're the only, and that our experience that we're more likely to experience racism and sexism and intersections of those spaces. We're also more likely to be cut out of networks because we don't fit necessarily because you're underrepresented. So there are many different situations that make our experience as black women unique and the stressful conditions that we face as junior faculty or faculty in higher education.
What do viable solutions look like at this point?
Well, viable solutions would be one, identifying the stressors that black women face and trying to mitigate the situations that they're in. Protections for women who are experiencing racism, harassment, discrimination in these spaces. Recognizing the fact that we come from historical disadvantage and are underrepresented, which means that in these spaces we are experiencing a lot of these stressors without now increasingly outside protections that we would like to see more of moving forward.
How has the conservative crackdown on DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion, how has that affected the effort to attract and retain black women in higher education?
So this is really the next stage of this, but I would say that it's definitely something that can have a effect on the ability to recruit and retain black women in academia. As mentioned, can really advise women to go into these spaces when being publicly have seen out and described it, and now without the protections of DEI, which was as a system was there to help increase diversity and inclusion overall being gone. This means that this would be a complicated situation for women to be in without having protections that might have been afforded by DEI previously.
Dr. Reed, we appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Scientists, researchers, and some companies are eager to jumpstart the next generation of computing, one that will be far more sophisticated and dependent on understanding the subatomic nature of the universe. But it's a huge challenge to take this new quantum leap forward. Science miles around the world.
It's a chandelier that may soon shed light on the true nature of nature. A quantum computer designed to understand the rules of the physical world, to find new ways to cure diseases, stop pandemics, develop renewable energy, and tackle the climate emergency. In quantum emergency, Nicholas Mechanics, the machine, not yours. Dario Gil is a senior vice president and director of IBM Research in Yorktown Heights, New York. Computers today operate in the binary language of ones and zeros. Fast and capable, sure, but they are, after all, digital totals of reality. So no matter how hard we try, the best way to do is to approximate the complexity of the world. And quantum is the first technology created that allows us to eliminate the behavior of nature world of quantum physics, to be able to simulate it, understand it better. These intricate machines are designed to do just that. At the bottom are simulated atomic particles called qubits, which act in mysterious, non-intuitive ways. The manner in which they spin and interact can greatly increase the capability and efficiency of computers. Besides being a potential game changer for solving problems in the natural world, quantum computers may lead to greater optimization, manufacturing, logistics, transportation, and finance, and they have potential to challenge and revolutionize encryption. Quantum physicist David Osman is a professor at the School of Molecular Engineering and Physics at the University of Chicago.
Well, I think our class will be a world and class model work very well. It's also quite good to us. But some of the things about the world black and white color.
He gave me a tour of his quantum measured laboratory. What is the goal? What are you up to here?
That's what we do for techniques. People look at individual electrons and atoms, see how they make one.
They combine fast pulses of light and microwaves to experiment with individual atoms and electrons.
And measure the particles, investigate them, and electron atoms.
So you're able to manipulate at the atomic level for controlling atoms.
With microwaves, and we program puzzles.
But controlling atoms is no small feat. It turns out qubits are very delicate, creating a big engineering challenge in designing quantum computers.
So we're in the Google Lab, and we're surrounded by fleet quantum computers.
Physicist Eric Lucero is a lead engineer for Google's quantum computing enterprise based in Santa Barbara, California.
Each one of these are protecting something slightly different.
Quantum computers are like a Rube Goldberg espresso maker in order to keep their fake qubits happy, and then remain able to compute puzzles that cannot be disturbed by the slightest bit of noise, electromagnetic or thermal.
We want to make sure the thermal is well below our quantum. Okay, so we make our system super electrons.
Which means they have to get cold, extremely cold. Everyone we went. Computers have HL to almost absolute zero, or about 460 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Simply sending command to and receiving responses from qubits without disturbing them is a Herculean task.
We're learning that information somewhere else, and we can interact. When we go actually interact with these systems, we can alter it.
As a result, quantum computers that exist today are riddled with errors. Researchers deal with this through statistical analysis and sophisticated error correction techniques. But achieving a fully error-corrected quantum computer is their goal.
The time for us is to build a following error correction.
The race is on to be first, and China appears to be the leader. Its announced investment in quantum computing is more than $15 billion. IBM and Google don't share the idea of spending internally on quantum computing research and development. But in May of 2023, the companies announced a $150 billion gift to the universities of Chicago and Tokyo to try and keep pace with the Chinese.
You're probably standing between two big quantum computers as well.
Depending on what back Yorktown Heights, I'm at IBM VP of Quantum, Day and better. The company is already rolling out quantum computers. They're not perfect, but are built with some error correction.
We can increase the rate at which we can say, well, let's continue to improve on performance. We're going to these, we have to do something. We're going to do classical computing.
The company has already deployed more than 75 quantum computers. Mostly users are trying to find ways to program these machines. It's entirely different than classical computer code.
It is definitely going to be a huge competition. I think this is going to be a decade where quantum computing emerges as a technology that will be a permanent part of the landscape of the world computing. But a race outside competition that will ends. I don't see this as ending.
Researchers say a practical error-free quantum computer may be a decade away. But the goal of solving huge problems with the smallest particles in the universe is unlearn enough to quicken their work. For the PBS Miles O'Brien in Yorktown Heights, New York.
Tomorrow marks 13 years since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. What began as a civil uprising that started the child the conflict now consumes half a million people. When fighting this opportunity, Islam State, also party journalists. Jim Full, when American journalist covering the war, when kidnapped by the terrorists in 2012 and publicly beheaded 2 years later. His murder shocked the world. A decade later, his mother, Diane Foley, tells Jim's story. Now she came to be a leading advocate for American holocaust abroad. New book, American Mother. And Diane Foley joins me now. Welcome back to the So you have joined Syrian Islam many times. Talk about Jim, talk about the extraordinary work that you do. What was it that told you you had to pull all this together in the book right now?
I really think the way we remember where we've been and our challenges going forward is by telling stories. Jim is a storyteller. All that you do, you help us remember what is happening in the world. And Jim, it was time. I was feeling that in 10 years. I'm sure some people were children what has happened to Jim, and we have accomplished a lot as U.S. government. I'm so grateful for all the people who stepped up and made it happen, donated, and such honors. But the challenge is great, and I just felt it was time to tell the story and learn from the people and to inspire others. Pick up the torch. And that's the other thing during the educational photo of the What's that for you see out there? Oh, Jim was such a, he was the oldest of 5 children. his son, but he's challenged me. He's challenged me because I failed him. I did. Our government failed him. We failed. The young Americans, not just GMT, so I left Peter Kasich, Angela, as well as Luke Summers and Warren Weinstein killed that same time. So we failed. And we learned. President Obama set up a hostage cell that still exists. We have a brilliant current hostage special envoy at the State Department. More than 100 people have come home since 2014. A lot of things accelerated. But the challenge remains. More and more countries are targeting our citizens. And we're very challenged as the full foundation, as our government to deal with it all.
You open this book, they have an absolutely astonishing moment, which is when you say I'm prosecute from women, pick up your son and brutal torture your son, and play 50 role, keep it in your son's death. And one of the first things to do is good way. People come to him. What do you want to say to him?
Well, Jim would talk to him. Jim would want to hear him out. Jim would live this franchise when people like Alexander, who's so vulnerable to all the radical station. But I also was not one to tell him who he was. And I really wanted to see him as a human being who had some power with justice. And it was good. It was good. I was grateful.
God gave him strength to do it. You look around, you're talking about the gun, I'm going to say, it is probably what you don't know about your own child. It is the same for every character that stuck around years later, you know Jim all that well, not an entirely after he was on. But anyway, so much. He was our oldest, and because we have 4 others, I was quite busy. And the younger ones working part-time, and I love working as a practitioner, so Jim, when he came home, wanted to be lots of how we were, what's up, what's going on. And he didn't share a lot about what he was up to. He really didn't share a lot. And it was really only after his death that I realized how many people he touched, how many lives he mentored, and because Jim never talked about it, you know. He mentored the foundation, that I carry today, the James Foundation, Marty Change, how he was our American Hostage Affairs, advocate for the dozens of Americans who are top right now. But as you know, I see how hard you work others who know the work that your family, that asks you to slow down. What is it that keeps you so determined and so dedicated and moving forward every single day? Well, I'm challenged by the needs that continue. We definitely improve this. We have a long ways to go. And we have nation states that are targeting our citizens now, and wrongfully arresting them. We've got to figure out how to deter this practice. We must, because a lot of people still suffer. And it's still hard to get attention from these things, even with the wrongful detention process. So, okay, we're struggling working with our government to try to figure out ways to help people understand where they are in the process and what is possible for the government, what is not, what we need third party experts to help with. Our government can do everything. So that's part of our role, trying to help families figure out how to get the attention they need to bring their what did Jim think we're doing today? I think he's doing something, to be honest, although I don't think he would have left his love of journalism. He believed in the power of journalism. And he really believed that we had to be in conversations. We had to be able to witness. He really believed in it. So I think he believed in what he was doing, and I think he would want someone to be advocating for those who are in hostage. The book is American Mother, written by Colin Camp and Diane Boyd. Thank you so much.
Anyways, here's more on my exclusive interview with Department of Secretary Alejandro Villas, and that is new for Night Agenda.
Now, I'm happy time is our team. Thank you very much.
Thank you for funding the BS and provided by the outcomes board of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the Nobel, including Leonard and Ronald and the GMT Global Foundation.
Actually, you don't need to do those things. It's like the writing technology, I got working. People know, no big deal.
Along our community service around Thursday, the Facebook keep track live. Arranging financial advisors get to know your passions and the way you enrich your community. Life well planned.
The Ford Foundation, working with the areas on the front lines of social change worldwide. And the outcomes board of these institutions. And friends of the Nobel. This program was made possible by Corporation Public Broadcasting and contributions to PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amish Shakil 5858. I am Ahmed Goodnam. Have a good life.